And our first keynote is Kristiaan Borret. We'll come back to Tallinn. And he is the bouwmeester of Brussels Capital Region. And we will hear what that means and what it doesn't mean. And you can speak yourself. Thank you, Kristiaan, for coming back.
Hello to everybody. Firstly, I would like to apologize because I'm having a stubborn flu. That is not due to your weather. I imported it from Brussels, because your weather is in fact very much like Belgian weather now. I will be talking about circular architecture today, but with a special focus on the reuse of buildings, adaptive reuse of buildings. I thank you for the invitation, and I think it's very important that in a country like Estonia, this circular architecture is put forward. It proves that you're, in fact, one of the interesting countries in Europe who are working on that subject. And I can imagine that it's, especially adaptive reuse of buildings, is a special thing in your country, because it might be that, in fact, you want to get rid of a lot of buildings from the Soviet period, for instance, because there is a kind of emotional connection with it. Or you're not sure about the quality of the construction of those buildings. There is no certainty about the materials used. So it might be very hard for you to develop this kind of ideas. It has been hard for us in Brussels as well. We have a kind of hate and love relationship with a lot of these buildings that I will show you, that are mostly office buildings from the 1960s until the 1990s. But first, perhaps 10 minutes on what the bouwmeester is in Brussels. So not only in Brussels, so in Belgium, since something like 2000, we installed a system of bouwmeesters in several cities and regions. It was inspired on the Dutch tradition of the Rijksbouwmeester, the national bouwmeester, that exists something like 200 years. It has been existing before in Belgium, but the tradition had been completely lost. So we imported ID in around 2000, and then we developed it and we made it better than in the Netherlands. So now they're looking to us how we are dealing with it. 2000 in Flanders and in Antwerp, 2009 in Brussels. So I'm the Brussels bouwmeester now. Before, I have been 10 years of the Antwerp bouwmeester. And then also in 2013 in Charleroi, in the French-speaking part of Belgium, in Ghent, a smaller city. And the Walloon government is still discussing about yes or no installing a bouwmeester, or maître architecte in French, next year. We are waiting for that. So what is the bouwmeester maître architect not doing? So I'm not in the hierarchy of the system. So I'm not the head of the planning administration of Brussels. I'm also not the one that is deciding, that is dealing only with the own projects of the city, or deciding on building permits, on planning permits. So in that sense, depends what Andro is doing. It's not always the same thing like a city architect that is existing in many cities. On the other hand, I'm also not just a consultant, and I'm also not a politician, even if you have in your system consultants who have become politicians. So what is the bouwmeester doing? The bouwmeester is appointed by the government, but working in an independent position. So this is crucial. And of course, the general task is to improve the design quality of all urban development projects in Brussels. So it's focused on design quality, on quality in the broad sense of the word. And then there is this kind of paradox. So the bouwmeester is in and out of the system. In the system because appointed by the government, and collaborating with all of the administrations, of course, but also out of the system because fully independent. Freedom of speech, we can do what we want. So I'm in a very comfortable position. I'm paid by the government to be critical about the government. Of course, you have to find an equilibrium. If you are every day critical about decisions or about policy, And especially if you're doing that every day in the press, after a while, you will use your impact because they will try to put you aside. On the other hand, if you're never critical and never improving projects, then you're just there for decoration, and then you're not a true bouwmeester. So you have to find the right balance between those two extremes. It's a person, the bouwmeester, appointed per term of 5 years. I'm in my second term until the end of this year, and I will not apply for a third term because the idea is that from time to time there is a new bouwmeester putting new emphases, bringing new perspectives. Also, perhaps after 10 years, you're getting a bit too much in the system and not anymore enough out of the system. The working of the BMA is free, so we're working free and paid by the government, and there is a team, very important, of 15 people who are collaborating with me. Those people, they will stay. The bouwmeester changes, but those people, they guarantee the continuity. What do? We have something like 4 pillars: competitions, research by design, design review, and the label BMA. I will be very short about that. So the main thing is competitions. So we organize in Brussels more or less 50 competitions per year, design competitions. That means every week a competition, small projects, big projects, urban planning projects, architecture projects, all feasibility studies, many kinds of competitions. There is a good competition system in Brussels. So this is about public procurement, in fact. So we call it competition, but it's a public procurement procedure, always in 2 steps. So in the first step, there is a public call, very low access criteria, so that young, promising architects can participate. So we ask never for a turnover. If the competition is for a swimming pool, we never ask that you have been building 6 swimming pools before. So we make very open access criteria. For instance, for a building of 10 million euro, you have to have built a building of only 3 million euro so that you can climb up and move up. The fee for the architect is always fixed. So no discussion about the fee afterwards. And then we select something like 3 or 5 candidates from the first step for the second step, where we ask to make a proposal. That proposal is remunerated. You're paid for that proposal. The jury criteria are exclusively on quality, so the fee doesn't play a role anymore. And the jury is professional, no politicians in the jury. And the transparency on decision and communication afterwards is high. So, for instance, we publish all of the competition entries after the competition so that people can compare and see what has been proposed. Examples, some eye candy, a footbridge by office between 2 parts of the Belgian parliament. Difficult projects. This is a community center on top of a metro entrance that was empty for something like 30 years because it's difficult to build. So these public commissions, they serve also to heal these kind of situations in the city. Private developers would never take the risk to build there. Public space. Here, when you enter Brussels by train, you can have a view on this new orange square, permeable square, skipping also part of the road that was there and creating public space that is really necessary in this dense central neighborhood of Brussels. Prestigious projects, like this is a huge building from the 1970s, former headquarters of an insurance company. And so it's a private developer who bought it. And we also organize as the bouwmeester competitions for or with private developers. So the building was redeveloped and transformed and adapted by a team with Caruso St. John and the Belgian office Bovenbouw. And the last one is the Canal Cultural Center in collaboration with Centre Pompidou that is being in construction site now and will be opening in 25. So a former Citroën garage, a huge site of 30,000 square meters along the canal in Brussels. We do research by design. That means we draw ourselves in the team, not to build it the way that we have drawn it, but to feed the debate. I think it's important in discussion, political discussions with government and administrations on quality, that it's not just in Word documents and Excel documents that things are discussed, but also by means of drawings, by means of visualizations. So we make these kind of drawings in our language of architects in order to feed the debate. And then two classic things, so design review. When you want to have a building permit in Brussels for projects above 5,000 square meters, you have to have a review of your project by the bouwmeester, and you have to add it to the building permit application, the planning permit application. And that helps us. The first intention is to have a leverage in order to force private developers to come and see us much more ahead. So not just on the moment of the building permit, because then it's too late. Everything is decided, everything has been drawn. I prefer to be there very much in the beginning of the project, because then you can still influence the project. And the last thing I will skip. So you've understood a position like the one of me in Brussels is not about deciding hierarchy. We have, let's say, nothing to decide, but a lot to say. So that's why we call it, it's a typical kind of soft power position. I think you need in urban development these kind of role, these kind of mechanisms. So you could have regulations and so on, and planning permits, all this kind of thing. Of course, they are important, but they only guarantee a basic level of quality. If you want to have something more, you need competitions, you need a quality chamber, you need discussions with civil society in order to improve the quality. So you need a soft power mechanism. So I wish Andro, if he's here, a lot of soft power. Right, hello. Adaptive reuse. This is the Palais de Granvelle in Brussels. It's a palace that was built in the city center around mid-16th century by Cardinal de Granvelle. And it stood there until 1930, when in Brussels there was a train connection made between the North Station and the South Station, two terminus stations, and they were linked with a tunnel and a viaduct and so on. So a lot of buildings had to be demolished in the city center in those times. That was one of them in 1930. And of course, you understand that a lot of the building materials, construction materials, have already been taken out of the building and are there well sorted, bricks with bricks, wood with wood, in order to be reused. And even more, if you could be able to read the small panel that is on the left, you would see that it is mentioned façade à vendre, façade to sell. So, and indeed, this façade of a 16th century palace was for sale and was then bought by a municipality who wanted to use it for their new city hall. Finally, they didn't use it. And the columns, in fact, they ended up in a cemetery somewhere in Brussels for constructing a kind of arcade. So what is, of course, for me, that was really a discovery, that is reuse of materials, that we consider circular architecture as something of our age, as something of new, was in fact existing in the 19th and early 20th century. So there is a kind of building tradition, construction tradition that we have lost, because we've been used to working with new materials, cheap materials, materials coming from all over the world. And we have forgotten that once this was the normal thing. There is this other anecdote of Palladio, who had, in fact, a kind of preference for reused materials. Because if you take a material that has been used already for 30, 40 years, it means that it is sturdy, that it has been able to survive, so that it's in fact good quality. So for Palladio, reuse was a kind of guarantee of quality. While today, with certification systems and so on, reuse is in fact suspect. It's uncertain. So it's time that we change our mentality, or that we become, in fact, that we go back in history and that we do as has been done before. So mentality shift is extremely important in this discussion, I think, on circular architecture in many aspects. To be more precise of Brussels and mentality shift. So also my mentality as a bouwmeester has been shifting. I should be honest about it. So in 2015, when I was starting, I organized a competition that was won by Office Kersten Geersdaven van Zeveren for building 3 residential towers on the site of a former empty office building. Partly this was a kind of revenge, because this is one of the postmodern office buildings by a big Flemish bank that were built in Brussels, that I've been protesting as a student in those times against those kind of buildings, because they were ugly architecture, and cutting off also the neighborhood that was behind from the canal, the water that is on this side. And then when I became a bouwmeester, of course, it was a big revenge to help demolishing this building and replacing it by fine architecture. On the other hand, today, I wouldn't do that anymore. We would keep the structure. We would surely replace the program of offices by housing. We would surely make better architecture and also, in fact, repair the connection with the neighborhood behind. But we wouldn't demolish everything anymore. So in 2017, so my story will be about this mentality shift and this need to go, as your vice mayor said, to go for systemic change. So I call it from pioneering to mainstreaming. In 2017, we organized a public discussion on what was happening with all of these office buildings from the 1970s until the 1990s in Brussels that were becoming empty, that were being demolished for being replaced by new office buildings. What about the quality of the architecture? What about the heritage aspect? Don't we have to keep some? Even the ugliest postmodern building is representative for a certain period, so you should perhaps keep some of them. What about the reuse and the carbon emissions that go together with the demolition of these buildings? So first, public discussion. Should I go or should I stay? A punk song of The Clash. In Brussels, you have rotor, and you can't underestimate the impact of rotor on the entire debate in Brussels. So they are truly, and they have a lot of merits, they are truly the pioneers of reuse in Brussels. They've been putting it on the agenda, and they have been so generous also to share their know-how with a lot of people. So you can see a kind of influence of rotor in the architects community and also in fact, the public, so people like me working on the public side. The influence of rotor is incredibly important. And that's, for instance, that's a competition we organized, one of the first projects where rotor was collaborating in a building project with West Architecten. So it's Zinneke, it's a non-profit organization that is organizing a parade in Brussels, and they need a new building, and in the backside of the building they prepare these kind of installations for the parade. So that's on the right side. So they have a lot of knowledge how to deal with materials. And And so that has been, in fact, a pioneer in changing the system also. So the first thing was the competition was special. So we didn't organize a competition where we invited 5 architects to make a full plan, but the competition, we invited 5 architects to go to the site where there was a kind of exhibition of materials, a catalog of materials, and each of those 5 architects had something like an afternoon, and they had to discuss with the team of Rotor and the team of Sinneke how they would be dealing with these materials, what they could be doing. So a kind of just a very intuitive workshop. And so that was, in fact, the competition. The second thing was changing the system of public procurement. Because so the winning architects, they had the idea, we will reuse windows like the ones in the back facade. We will reuse parts of staircases, so on the left down there, so the original staircase with the white one in metal, that is a staircase that comes from elsewhere. But this is a public procurement. You just can't go and buy something. You have to organize a procurement, a marché public. And so Rotor developed systems also to organize these kind of procurement systems for the works. So not for the design, but for the works, for the contractors. That was very important. Together with the bouwmeester, they developed this kind of specifications, in fact. And the third thing was really on the side of the public authority, the building permit. So in Brussels, your building permit has to be, you have to draw everything like it will be executed. So that means you have to draw the windows as you want them as an architect. But in this case, windows would be reused. And they didn't have yet the windows, because that depends on what is available on a building site, on a demolition site somewhere else. And there is a lot of time between making the building permit application and the construction moment. So you won't buy windows already now when you only need them in perhaps 6 months or 1 year. And so that was a problem. Computer says no. And so with a lot of discussion with the planning permit administration, they finally agreed for the back facade, not for the front facade, that there would be a drawing with a dotted line saying, within this frame, there will be a window. So very open, not yet sure about the precise size and shape of the window. That was a big struggle and a big victory that they accepted. And of course, the architects used it and made profit of it. So they bought a window, the one that is U-shaped, that is normally, of course, in the other way. It's the 19th century window. And because now they had a kind of carte blanche within this dotted line, they decided to put it upside down to make a joke of it. So this project has been pioneering for the architecture itself, for the new kind of aesthetics, but also on those 3 levels, very administrative levels, in fact. Second project that has been finished last week. So this is a Recipark, so a recycling installation where you go to throw away things that will be reused afterwards. It's a project by 51N4E. And so the client is the Brussels organization of waste management. It was a competition. And the recycling installations in Brussels now are covered because when it rains, people don't go there to throw away their things, so they want to make it more used, and so they are now covered. And then in the competition, 51N4E proposed to reuse wooden beams for the covering, for the roof structure. And so they found out, together with Rotor, that somewhere in Wallonia there was a horse riding school that was empty, that would be demolished. They've been selecting the wooden beams over there, transporting them to Brussels, refurbishing them, and then reusing them for the construction. So next step So not just finishing materials or materials like a window or a staircase on the inside, but really the structural elements. So you can reuse structural elements as well. It was a hard job to have certifications. So the public client was great because he supported it all of the time. He could have said, okay, let's stop now. We won't take the risk. But he went on and went on. And so in the end, for instance, so that's what you see on the right below, they were forced to use 2 beams. Because if one beam would be a problem, there would be always the other beam that can take over the role. Next step. This was one of those buildings, office buildings from the 1960s, empty, prefab concrete construction, cheap building because it's empty somewhere in Molenbeek. On the other hand, we have an urgent need for new schools. So both elements have met, and it was decided that there would be a new school in that building and that it should be refurbished extremely quickly. And so that's why the architects decided, okay, if it has to be quickly, and cheap, we will also use the materials that are already in the building. So they've been reusing the partition walls, these kind of white walls that are typical for office buildings, and adding them in wood so that it becomes a kind of double reading, the parts that were necessary to make the adjustments. What was here an important lesson is that in circular architecture and reuse of buildings, the inventory is crucial. So those architects, they spend a lot of time just in writing down what was in the building. Because then you can start making the puzzle. First you have to know what is there, and then only you can start designing. So for us, that was a lesson that it's a huge job. It takes a lot of time and money. So we recommend clients now to make this kind of inventory on beforehand so that it is available for all of the competitors in the competition. Project by Agua. And then to have one that is a bit stepping out of this kind of reuse of buildings. Circular architecture is in fact also about new constructions and about anticipating future adaptation. So not making the same mistakes as in the past. So how can we make the building ready for other uses in the future? It's a lot about anticipating dismantling. So no glue, only screws, for instance. But it's also about, that was the case here, in fact, about the structure of the building. So this is a new garage by D'Ieteren. So that's the Volkswagen Audi car importer in Brussels. And they are very clever. So the Volkswagen importer in Brussels is preparing the age without cars. So it's strong, I think, from their side. So they know that they will need less space for selling cars in the future, and they are now selling bicycles, for instance, and so on. And so they wanted a building that was open for many uses. And so they were ready to pay something like 5 or 10% more for the structure, so that the structure would be able to accept all kinds of uses in the future, other bearing loads and so on. The project was won by Xavier de Geiter, who made the structure completely in concrete, on the other hand, but that's the way he is. And in fact, so the waffle structure allows that walls can be put everywhere. There's also kind of secondary structure in steel. You can see the red lines in the drawing. Intermediate floors that can be removed or changed more easily. So this building is taking into account future change of use. That's also important, I think, so on the level of circular architecture in the case of new construction. That was pioneering with convinced clients, mostly public clients, but also private clients. Since 2020, we've been pushing the market. So the ordinary also the standard developers who were making office buildings in Brussels. One of them is a very fine developer on that level, is Whitewood, who was already believing in circular architecture. So this was in the city center, refurbishment of an office building, an office tower for offices, keeping the structure, of course, but also being exemplary on the level of reuse. So a lot of materials that were taken out of the building were reused on site, and also some other materials coming from other construction sites were reused. Fine materials, for instance, very beautiful granite floor slabs designed by a famous interior designer, Jules Waps, that comes from another building. And that thanks to the system of buying and selling that Rotor has been organizing, it's called Opalis in Brussels, that could be bought and brought to this site. Also, for instance, the technical installations, the ventilation system that was on top of this building was still functioning, but not meeting the standards for new office premises. And so the ventilation system was taken down, put on a truck, and brought to Zinneke, the first project with the dotted line window that I've been showing you, and immediately installed in that building. So even those kind of ventilation systems, if you can organize, because that's a typical problem, the transfer, so that there is not too much time in between where you have to find storage somewhere, even that kind of ventilation systems can be reused. Another office building in the European quarter. The developer wanted it to demolish it. And all of us, me, the bouwmeester with my soft power, but also the the planning application department with the hard power, they just said no, you should keep it. And so finally the architects came up with a solution, because the problem was whether there was, you can see on the left side, there is a kind of big core in the middle. So the office floors were very much fragmented. So no open office floors as what is today usual. And so they came up with the idea to have a huge beam, a Vierendeel beam on top of the building. And in fact, to replace all of the columns that were load-bearing by steel cables or something like that, so that the floors would be hanging. So that means less thick columns on each floor, and also on the ground floor, an open span, and you could organize a big conference hall there, which was also necessary for the building. So adaptive reuse is not always about physical materials and using them, about the materiality, but also sometimes about changing the structural organization of the building. For me, adaptive reuse, like in this case, is often partial demolition and partial new materials. The goal, in order to reuse, as a general, sometimes you have, of course, to replace and to add new materials. Finally, the balance should be right. Now it looks like in Brussels everything is fantastic, which is not the case. So sometimes, well, quite often, we have developers who just don't like reuse. So this is another office building in the European quarter. Gelamco is a developer, wanted to demolish everything because the floor-to-ceiling height in this building is something like 240 or 250, and the EU asks for new offices something like 260. So because of this 10 centimeter difference, a whole building should be demolished. Of course, that's crazy on the level of embodied carbon and CO2 emissions that are necessary to produce a new building. So we challenged them, and as the bouwmeester, we organized, we had a call for 3 technical experts that can help us, because we don't have this kind of specialized knowledge. So this was the proposal of Gelamco. The problem is the red beam that is too low, and the fact that the ventilation system is below the window sills. And they were saying, okay, if you want, but dear bouwmeester, if you want to keep the building and we have to renovate it in order to make it new premium offices, we have to have new ventilation on the ground floor, and then you can see you will only have 2.47 meters, and even below the red beam, there will be not space left enough, only 2.17 meters. So it's not possible. So that's what we often get in this kind of discussions. I said, okay, we will ask 51 and 4E to make a second opinion study. And they have been developing a lot of alternatives. Okay, you could demolish the critical points, replace the critical points, something like 5% of the existing structure. You could also do something else. You could, if you, in scenario 2, if you remove 20% of the floors, you could replace them by wooden floors and so on. So they've been instrumental for us to prove, versus the private developer, that alternatives exist. So that his story of there is no alternative was not true. So that's also important on the level of policy, that you have this kind of technical knowledge that we don't have, but that 51 and 4E is having, that you can mobilize it and bring it into the discussion. And so that's where we are now. So that was very helpful also, this kind of counter projects and let's say a bit aggressive position of on our side. Okay, if you say that it's not possible, we will show you with our experts that it's not possible. That was also challenging the experts of the developers, who were in fact saying what our client was asking for because he was paying them. It was also challenging, in fact, the professional integrity of the engineering office that was supporting the client. If you say it's not possible, that means you're not smart enough, because here are our experts who show you how you could do it. This kind of assertive, if not aggressive, position of public authority, I think it's useful. We shouldn't be just always believing what private developers are saying. So for now, these are 9 examples of office buildings from the 60s until the 90s that are empty in Brussels, because we have a shrinkage, of course, of office, the needs of office space, like in all cities, and that are now all in planning permit situation for reconverting to housing while keeping the building structure. So I think 10 years ago, all of these buildings would have been demolished to rebuild housing projects. Now, in Brussels, you have a lot of examples that show that in the existing concrete structures of office buildings, it's feasible and also affordable to make new apartments. And so it's becoming more and more the rule in Brussels. It's even taken over also by the developers themselves now. So this is the City Forward project. That is 300,000 square meters of office buildings owned by the European Commission, have been sold to the Belgian state, and the Belgian state is redeveloping them together with Whitewood, the developer. So 300,000 square meters in the European quarter. That's a lot of buildings. And the idea is to redevelop them. Firstly, 30% of them, of the surface, will be housing and public amenities, which is important for us as urban planners, because this is a monofunctional office district. So it will bring life into the district. It's still the most expensive office district of Brussels. So urban mixed use, that's nice. But secondly, the developer, City Forward, is very open, in fact, spontaneously wants to reuse the buildings everywhere and also reuse a lot of materials, but in the first place, reuse the existing concrete structure. So this is for us a major breakthrough that even in the most expensive office neighborhood in Brussels, you can work with reuse projects and they will be premium quality offices and also, of course, housing. My last slide is what could be, let's say, the climax of this evolution from pioneering to mainstreaming. It's the less exciting thing, but it's crucial. So the final point of mainstreaming would be that it is just into regulations, that reuse of building structures or reuse of materials is imposed by law. And so we had a lot of discussions with Roter how to do it. And it appears that for imposing, perhaps, so because the building code in Brussels is in reform now. So since the middle 2023, we are working on that. First idea was to impose for all projects in Brussels a certain percentage of reused materials. That was not feasible. That's what Roter said as well, because there is not yet a kind of coherent classification or nomenclature, so of what is a reused material. So that's too early. There's a lot of discussion, how should you calculate it in volume or in weight, for instance? That makes a lot of differences. The other thing is that on the reuse of buildings as a whole, before, if you would apply for a building permit in Brussels and you demolish a building and you may propose a new building, you never had to explain why you demolish. So that was taken for granted. That was not discussed in the building permit. It was only about a new building. And so we wanted to reverse the order. And so in the proposal for the reform, there is just one sentence that says that every existing building should be maintained and, if necessary, renovated. The full or partial demolition of the structure of the building can only be granted after a full evaluation taking into account a lot of arguments. So that's simple but crucial. It turns the other way around the normal situation. Instead of not having to explain why you demolish, the first step in the future will be that you have to explain and to convince that you should demolish. I'm not against all demolitions. I just want that we don't demolish without thinking, thoughtlessly, that we reflect about it and that we motivate it and that we know what we're doing. So that's the purpose of this new rule in the building code. That was unfortunately not approved. Not approved because the building code is a huge package. There's a lot on public space and there's a lot on less parking for public space. There was, for instance, that's another discussion, the same revolutionary proposal that all public space, in all public space everywhere in Brussels, maximum 50% could be for private cars. And so there was a lot of political discussion on that, and that contaminated, in fact, this part as well. Even if this was not yet fully criticized. So the building code in Brussels is not approved. We had elections in June. We don't have yet a new government. We are waiting for a new government. In Belgium, having new governments can take a long time. We had, I think, a world record for the Belgian government that it has taken more than 1 year. But I'm still hoping that the next Brussels government then will approve the building code so that this rule could be applied. If you want to know more about reuse of buildings in Brussels, with the bouwmeester maître architect, we just published a book with a lot of projects in it. On the cover of the book is a project by BC Architects, who will be giving you a presentation in the afternoon. That's also the reason why I didn't include any project by BC, because I guess they will present them themselves. So if you are interested in to know more about these kind of reuse projects in Brussels, you can download the book for free on our website. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful, really interesting, truly. You are the one who is bringing change into the system, picking on the system.
I'm not the only one, but I'm in a position where I can, in fact, help many people to bring the change into the system. Yeah.
Could you open up on the team also? You have 15 people on the team, right? Who are they? Are they architects, planners, landscape architects, or some other disciplines?
Yeah, I think 80% of them are architects, and then we have a landscape designer or people, for instance, with a first diploma on history, and they've been doing urban planning or urban management later on. So, yeah.
So multidisciplinary.
Multidisciplinary, but also focused on design, because that's the core of our team, in fact, the quality of design and also the power of design to find solutions. Because the bouwmeester team also doesn't want to be replacing another administration. So our core competence is design, and then we collaborate with all of the other administrations.
Please, questions to Kristiaan. Here, Roland has a hand up.
Thank you for the talk. It's very exciting. You've shown a lot of successful projects. Could you share a project where you've put your leg down too strongly, or where the mandate has gone that was unsuccessful, a project?
Yeah, well, the first one was unsuccessful, demolishing a building that was only 20 years old, and I was even part of the decision-making on that. So sometimes it's about mentality. What is often a problem is not so much, in fact, the price of the materials, but the fact that it's a difficult process. So the market for construction materials is organized in a very easy way. But if you have to reuse materials, you have to know the what we call the filière, so where to find them, and you have to be able also to buy materials and to have them in storage for a time until the project will start. So this kind of, the fact that the market system of buying and selling materials still has to be fully developed is really a problem. And that in many cases we have been forced to accept that it wouldn't be possible. But even that is changing, because BC is collaborating with a construction company, Democo in Belgium, and we organized a competition because Democo, so the contractor, one of the contractors in Brussels, is preparing himself for this kind of problem in the market, and is now building a hangar for temporary storage of building materials within the city of Brussels, so that they could be flexible, so that they could dismantle materials and have them in storage for a time and then reuse them in next buildings. So I hope that will solve some of the problems.
Thank you for the presentation. Question, how much power do you have? Like you described a situation where your experts were providing solutions how to rebuild the existing building. Like who finally decides? Do they have to do that or not? And then also, obviously, probably always, like refurbishing is more expensive. Like how long the developer can hide behind the excuse that it's more expensive, and yeah, so on. So who decides finally?
Well, the power is the power of argumentation. So if someone brings an argument, then you bring a counter argument, and then the other one, if the other one wants to be a reasonable person, he has to understand that the counter argument is in fact stronger than the argument. For instance, on the price, So we've been comparing prices or other. So bouwmeester also, it's not always we are again, so it's collaborating with other administrations. So for instance, the planning organization Perspective has been evaluating prices. There has also been a research project by the Université Libre de Bruxelles, by the university, bringing in fact, making an analysis of does it cost effectively. And then the conclusion was refurbishing doesn't cost more. It's the same price. It's not less expensive, but it's not more expensive. And so when you can put the numbers on the table, that's an argument. Who's deciding? So it's also about convincing people behind the scenes, convincing politicians, convincing people in the city administration, who are sometimes easy to convince because they share the same idea, the same belief. They just lack facts, for instance, or arguments. And so we bring them, we offer them. So it's about this kind of ecosystem of a coalition of the willing, and that's working well. Sometimes it doesn't work. So there are examples where we know that in some municipalities in Brussels, people are less in favor of reuse. Okay, then, but then, you know, if you can make progress with the majority of the other municipalities, they will be left behind, and a certain day they will have to evolve as well.
Thank you.
So your superpower is a negotiator.
Yeah, but again, so the power of the position is that you're able to do that. That you're able to decide or to propose and to find money for this kind of experts, to take initiative.
Sure.
And so that's crucial, that you're something like a free bird in the system, who can also help the other ones in that way. And be more frank. So I've been brutal towards some developers. So that's part of the role as well. While the civil servant working for the city and dealing with the building permits can't be that brutal. While in my position, I can be that.
We have 2 more questions. I saw hands raising.
Thank you. We met briefly before your speech, but for the context, for the rest of the audience, I'm Ines Karkolahti. I currently work in the detail planning in Helsinki as the chief architect in the Central District. And I would like to tap on one of your points on the regulation. I think it's of key that we find ways into turning the regulation so that we demand explanations on why something needs to be demolished. And I was just curious what you saw as a sufficient explanation on why something needs to be demolished. Like, what did you propose as the baseline?
Yeah. So in the former version, it was more precise. For instance, for buildings above 5,000 square meters, I think we asked for a bilan carbone, so a CO2 calculation with certain standards. Finally, it was not included. So you could say it has been weakened slightly. On the other hand, I know, so that would have been better. That would have been ideal. On the other hand, it's, so you have this kind of expression, the best in Dutch, but then so the best might be the enemy of the good. So it was better to keep this in order to lose everything. For me, that's enough, because there is this kind of evolution in Brussels. So that's lucky us that there are some developers also believe in this and they can be exemplary. And so it also works in that way that the other developers, they understand now. Because most developers in Brussels are still Belgian developers. That's important, not foreign developers. No BlackRock in Belgium, because with BlackRock you can't discuss, you don't know who to talk to. With Belgian developers, you can also make them, yeah, okay, you have to take your responsibility. If you don't want to, you lose your reputation in Belgium as a top developer, you should do some reuse projects as well. Don't be old-fashioned. So that helps. So it's enough in the building code that there is a kind of anchor to open the discussion. So for me, that was enough. The difficult thing in regulations is to choose the right moment. So when is the tipping point that you can impose it by law and that the market is more or less ready? Not fully ready, because imposing it by law will be accelerating it. So that's your team. But you can't accelerate something that is not yet present at all. So you have to choose the right moment. 10 years ago in Brussels, so before I was working, passive house standard was made compulsory by law for all housing projects, offices and schools, I think so. And so that again was the same thing. So when it has been imposed by law, there has been 5 years of 10 years of preparation, subsidies, capacity building, sharing knowledge and so on. And when the market was more or less ready, you could impose it by law. So we are in the same situation now. There are a lot of architects who know how to do it. There are developers interested. So the market is prepared. So I think in order to accelerate and to generalize, to mainstream it, this is the moment to impose.
It's all about timing.
Yeah.
Did you get your answer?
Yes, thank you.
There's another hand at the end. I have a question also regarding the building code. How often do you get invited to talk about what regulations do we need to change, how to update strategic documents from the political side?
Yeah. So there is so Belgium has a complicated system on the institutional level. We have regions and so on. There is one big advantage that because Brussels is a region and changing the law for urban planning, it's a regional competence. So that means we can do it without the rest of the country. And then because Brussels is a region and a city region, we have something like a common urban issue. So if you have to discuss with, for instance, if the building code in Flanders, it's much more difficult because you have to discuss with small municipalities somewhere in east of Flanders who are not so much into mixed use, density, and so on, who are anti-urban. So that means it's easier in Brussels. We make our own laws, so that's one thing. And then normally it's something like every 10 years.
Okay.
So you can't change it continuously.
Sure. But you are in the discussions.
Yeah, the bouwmeester is involved in the discussions, as many other experts are involved in discussions.
Yeah, cool. So with a question at the end.
Can you very briefly elaborate on the development of the technology of archiving these materials?
Yeah.
You can't hear. Can you very briefly elaborate on the development of technology for archiving these construction materials? What the technology and how it's evolving for archiving these construction materials?
Archiving or?
So you mean like...
for reuse, for reuse.
Okay. Yeah, for reuse. Well, the technology partially is very old-fashioned technology. So we can see that a lot of manipulating these materials is in fact like in former times. It's a lot of labor, handwork, so it's expensive. Rotor has been very helpful in also, for instance, in reinventing methods to clean materials more easy. They have now a very good method of taking the cement away from tiles, for instance. Before you had to do it by hand. Now they have a kind of chemical process. So even there, things are developing, but that's because one of the problems is, so you have a problem of this kind of selling and buying materials. The other problem is so labor methods and the expertise that is lacking. And that is taking a lot of money because you have to pay for labor. On the other hand, the political argument is, and so also thanks to the crisis of materials where the construction materials were going high in price, so then before reusing materials were more expensive than new materials. Thanks to the construction materials crisis, they became at the same level. The political argument is that, and also my argument is, we prefer to pay for low-skilled workers working in Belgium, working on local materials in order to clean them and to reuse them, instead of paying for natural stone coming from Bangladesh in unclear conditions, how they have been resourced and so on, and you're paying the profit of who you don't know. So it's also kind of an ethical issue. But it's giving work to more people in Brussels. We have a lot of unemployment for low-skilled people, so that's also a political argument.
What about if we take the example of this ventilation system that you reuse, then we already have the BIM model, or how do you solve this? Do you measure everything and then?
No. In fact, this is by chance. So many of them are successes by chance. So that's because Rotor was working on the both construction sites, so they knew of the possibility to move them. But that's important in the organization of the city. This kind of, so that's also, I think, one of the forces of the soft power of the bouwmeester, because we're working in a very transversal way, so that you can join the dots. You shouldn't underestimate how it's important that in a city that there is a kind of horizontal connection, because this brings this kind of successes. Nowadays, for instance, that developer, Whitewood, so the one who sold the ventilation system of the roof, is now doing the 310 square meters of European buildings in the European quarter. They have been professionalizing as well. So they're also ahead now of the other developers. So for them, it's also a kind of argument. So they know how to organize the filière, so the streams, the current of the material reuse.
Thank you, Kristiaan. I'm sure you have a lot of questions. We will keep them for the last panel, and we will discuss the same subjects again. And Kristiaan will be also on stage later on, but also, of course, you can chat with him off stage. Thank you.